Good morning everyone and welcome to another webinar from TPN Credit Bureau. Today we're going to be discussing the important topic of exemptions in schools. With me today is Ashleigh Laurent. She is the legal counsel with TPN Credit Bureau, and Coetzee, account manager with TPN Credit Bureau. People are attempting to defraud schools to try and get a lesser amount on their school fees, and those are school fees that you as a school rely on to operate day to day. So without wasting too much time, we're going to jump right into it. And Ashleigh, can you just give us a little bit of a brief overview of what exactly exemptions are and how they fit into our law?
Absolutely, Greg. So just to give our viewers a bit of a background into the premise of exemptions, right? It is to ensure compliance with Section 29, that is the right to basic education in our Constitution. And that obligation doesn't just lie with schools. It doesn't just lie with parents or caregivers, but it also lies on the state as well. So that's why we have the South African Schools Act and also the regulations, which clearly defines what exactly constitutes an exemption. So as per the regulations, it's defined as the total, partial, or conditional exemption granted to parents who are unable to pay school fees from the payment of such fees. So it is essentially a financial concession.
Actually, now that you've mentioned the different types of exemptions that parents can receive, would you mind elaborating just a bit more on those different types?
Absolutely, Chanel. So the regulations stipulate the various categories of exemptions a parent can receive. And starting off with our automatic exemptions. So automatic exemptions are granted to people who have parental responsibilities over orphans, children in foster homes, and it also is in respect of our child-headed households. Automatic exemptions are granted on presentation to the SGB of a affidavit, a confirmatory affidavit from a social worker or a court order. So those are automatic exemptions.
So those are basically for households that are vulnerable and need a little bit of extra financial support.
Absolutely, Greg, yeah.
Just before we go a little bit further, for those of you who haven't already done so, please make sure that you've logged into our YouTube page, make sure you've hit like and subscribe, and make sure that you are asking your questions in the chat. I have a laptop sitting here in front of me and I'm monitoring those questions, so I'll be able to pull them directly through to the studio, and we'll be able to answer those questions a little bit later on in the session. But if you ask a question that comes up that's relevant at the time, I'll interrupt the two ladies on the couch and ask that question.
We look forward to receiving them.
Yeah. Actually, sorry, I interrupted you. Can you tell us a bit about the other types of exemptions that are available other than the automatic exemption?
Absolutely. So we have our total exemptions, which is granted in respect of a calculation set out in a formula based in the regulations. So we will get to the formula a bit later, but it's if parents have 10% or higher in respect of that formula, which we'll address a bit later, but also if they are granted an automatic exemption. Then we have our partial exemption, which is a financial concession in respect of part of the school fees. So that is the partial exemption, and then we have what's known as a conditional exemption, which is in respect of two circumstances. The first is if the parent is granted a partial exemption, but even on the basis of the partial exemption being granted, they are still unable to afford that partial exemption based on personal circumstances beyond their control. The other is if they were not granted the exemption and they make a plea to the SGB that because of personal circumstances beyond their control, they would like a conditional exemption. And it is, of course, for the SGB to decide that, but the conditions will be attached to that application, and the SGB can grant that conditional exemption.
When you're dealing with a conditional exemption, can you maybe give us a couple of just real-world examples of what exactly those conditions that might be attached to those exemptions look like? What are the sort of conditions that we could expect?
Absolutely. So in respect of if a parent receives any sort of increase in their gross income in the year, they have an obligation to notify the school that, hey, I've received an increase, and they do have to notify. The school will then have a look at that and consider it.
what would be sort of the implications if for whatever reason they didn't actually declare it? Does it constitute fraud, or is it something that's an offence in terms of the Act?
Well, Greg, it's not really set out within the regulation itself. So I would be incorrect to say, yes, it is
it's probably more a case
issue
of just misleading the
Correct.
schools.
It is an issue of misleading the school, but there is an obligation, obviously, to notify the school. And of course, if the school becomes aware of it at a later stage, it would be a thing of reconsidering.
It's also something that they would be able to establish on the TPN system.
Yes.
By having a look at the parent monitoring. They will easily pick up on the change of financial status on the monitoring.
Exactly,
That's
and Chanel's going to show us a little bit more in studio here on her laptop. She's going to give us a bit of a demonstration of the TPN system and exactly how you can use the system to take you through these exemption processes and pick up on change in financial circumstances. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But okay, let's say now I am the school and I'm receiving a application from a parent for an exemption. If I was a parent, how do I go about getting my exemption forms? How do I actually apply to the school?
So Greg, the role of the parents is first to go to the school to request the application form for an exemption. They can approach the school directly, email the school, or approach the chairperson of the school governing body to request the form. The form is set out in Annexure B of the regulations. And then what's important for parents to know is that this is an annual duty. It's an annual obligation of the parent to go and request it each year. It's not a once-off, I have an exemption whilst my child is at school.
Keeps rolling.
Exactly,
Yeah.
because circumstances do in fact change. And so that is why it is an annual process for schools.
Ashleigh, earlier we were actually discussing the different types of documents that parents would have to also submit. Would you mind explaining and sharing those different documents that parents would have to provide in support of that exemption application? Absolutely.
So it is very much dependent on the type of exemption they're requesting. As I mentioned earlier, with automatic exemptions, you would have your affidavit, your confirmatory affidavit from your social worker or a court order.
Just while we're on the topic of automatic exemptions, we've had our first question come in from Odette Swift here.
Yes.
She's asking, are all learners whose family receive a child care grant for a child with a disability an automatic fee exemption?
Well, if we look at the definition of automatic exemption within the regulations, you will see that any child grants fall within the realm of automatic exemption. So it's definitely something that the SGB must consider because it falls within the definition of automatic exemption within the regulations.
We have another question that's come through from Anita Pillay, but Anita, we will be getting to your question shortly. It's coming up very soon on our to-do list, so we'll get to you a little bit later.
I think, as I was saying with the exemption, so it's very much dependent on the type of exemption you are applying for, but also it's done on a school-by-school basis, right? You will have your Annexure B application form, but then you will have pay slips from both parents or a letter from their employer stating how much they earn, bank statements, ID. So it's very much like as if you were applying, for example, a credit application. And then also it's important to note that if the parent is unemployed or self-employed, they need to make an affidavit to the school to that effect. And you know, something like if the parent is a commission earner, again, an affidavit and perhaps looking at the previous earnings to consider, that would help the SGB to make that consideration. What's important for the school to note in this regard is that they are reasonable in their request for documents.
Yeah, and actually at the beginning of the webinar, we sort of touched briefly on the increase in fraudulent applications that have gone around. And this is obviously where TPN can get involved and assist you with assessing whether or not fraud is the case. But if you are a parent who's maybe watching this and contemplating fraudulently misleading a school, which please don't, what are sort of the repercussions if someone gets found guilty of fraud?
Greg, I think what's important to note is differentiating, and the school or the SGB must be able to differentiate between what is an accidental error, and quite clearly an accidental error, and that where the school can clearly prove that the parents had intent to defraud. And what's important for parents to note is that an intent to defraud or lie to a institution does constitute fraud, and that does carry serious issues and complications that follow.
Yeah, I mean, you could end up with jail time, you could end up with fines, or some combination of both. So we're now going to get into a little bit of a showcase of the TPN system. This is where Chanel's going to be joining us up at her laptop now. Chanel, can you just show us sort of from now the perspective of, I'm a school, I've received an exemption application from a parent, and now I need to go through the system and capture the information I've been given and start making my assessment.
Yes, yeah. So let's take a look at that and how you can use the TPN system effectively to start that process and confirm the documents that you have received. Once you sign in on the TPN system, you will start with your credit application, where on step 1 you will complete all of the information as you have received it from that parent's application form. I do want to point out that when entering the first name and surname for that parent, it is important to ensure that you capture that information directly off of their ID document that they have supplied you with, as this can affect the ID verification that you then select on step 2. Once you've completed everything on step 1, you will click on Next. And here I would like to draw your attention on the consumer verification specifically. So like Greg and Ashleigh mentioned earlier, it is vitally important to ensure that this person you are working with is indeed actually who they say they are. So for this reason, it is important to ensure that your verify identity tick box is selected, as this will run a status check against the Department of Home Affairs, and it will also return back with a photo of what they should look like. It is also on this section where you can find the recent valuable and awesome feature that we have created on the system, which is called the Verify Income Directly with Bank feature. This will allow you as the school to request up to 6 months' bank statements directly from that parent's bank itself. You will also have the ability to verify the address information that they've supplied you with. And then lastly, on this section, it is important to ensure that you tick the compliance checkbox in order to confirm that you have received written permission or consent before processing that credit application.
Yeah, this is vitally important because the National Credit Act obviously requires that if you're accessing someone's personal information and credit information, that you have that valid written consent to have that information. If for whatever reason you don't, it is potentially a breach and you would be reported to the National Credit Regulator, and if this is something that we find to be an abuse of the system, we would obviously have to close your account. So make sure that in your application documents that you have, that you include a paragraph that says that you provide written consent for the school to obtain information from the credit bureau.
Yeah, thanks.
If you don't have a consent clause, you can get in touch with us directly. Chanel will be able to assist you in providing you with a copy of that. We'll give you some details towards the end of the session on how you can get in touch with us.
Perfect. Yeah, you can copy and paste it into your own application form.
Exactly.
Basically. So
we'll
we
be
can
able to
provide you with a clause like that. Thanks, Greg.
Yep.
Then once you have ensured that you've selected all of these tick boxes, when you click on Next, it will then take you through to the report selection, where you will then ensure that your Smart Check inquiry is automatically ticked. And because you have selected to generate and request the ID verification and the online bank statements on the previous page, we will then also ensure that these 2 tick boxes are automatically selected for you on step 3. When you scroll down, you can click on Perform Credit Check, and then you will be given an additional step where you then have to enter the parents' banking information that they've supplied you with in order for you to request those 6 months' bank statements directly from their bank.
Chanel, a nice question that's actually just come through here is, if you want to run a credit check on someone who is a foreign national, doesn't have a South African ID number, you also have the ability on the system to run that credit check on someone's passport number as well as their ID number.
Yes, you can. So yeah, you can perform credit checks on either an individual with an ID number or a passport number. The only difference is with the passports, there's no photo that will return from Home Affairs because there's no ID verification as such that can be conducted, but you can still run the check based on what they've given you.
Perfect.
Thank you. Okay, once you have completed the banking information on that additional step, you can click on Finish, which will then bring up your credit check result. Here I would like to focus on the ID verification that has returned for that parent application that you are busy with. So it is important to ensure that all of these flags that return, on this example, we can see that they have been this person has been successfully verified against the Department of Home Affairs and also the National Populations Register. We can clearly also see that it's returned back with a photo of what he should look like. If you can see there's a clear difference and it's not the same person, there's obviously a very big problem there. And also with these flags that has returned back from the ID verification that's been done, if you end up seeing something different, something like a ID blocked, not matched, or it's not found on HANAS, I do urge you to reach out to our help desk department so that they can also view the results, investigate it for you, and then advise accordingly from there. In terms of a legal perspective, guys, are there any vital points that you would like to maybe highlight here in terms of verifying the identities of the parent applications?
It's just very important to make sure that the person who's standing in front of you and making an application is the person that you have on the system. You know, there is potential for fraud in submitting the details of someone else. It is very, very difficult to sometimes come across it. So when you look at the ID verification, make sure that everything matches, make sure that the photo is the person you've been dealing with, make sure that the ID number and names are correct. Just be very, yeah, exactly. Just be very cognizant and wary when looking at the ID verification, and cautious. Err on the side of caution and make sure that you're 100% correct before you go forward.
Yes.
Great. So Chanel, schools don't just have to rely on IDV, right? They can also verify online bank statements through VOBS. Will you explain to our viewers VOBS?
Yes. Chanel, before you dive into it, we actually have a question from Fadia Adams, and this is gonna be great for you. How do we handle situations with a parent who is unemployed, however earns large amounts of funds via cash or cash deposits, and they're not declaring it? So this is perfect for your verified online bank statements.
Yes.
Obviously, if they receive physical cash money, it's a paper. We can't exactly look at it digitally and online.
Yeah. And then just from a legal perspective as well, is that we need to look at the definition of income, right? It's not just your salary, your wage received, but it's anything in respect of investments or any profit received from certain businesses. So the school would have to consider that, and they can consider it through VOBS as well.
Exactly.
And then the parent, if something like that happens, the parent kind of has to ensure that they disclose all of that information.
Absolutely.
In terms of how they are getting those funds and where it's from. In terms of the verified online bank statements, this is a feature that has been specifically created to confirm real-time income versus expenditure, and then most importantly, as we are busy with the fraudulent documents today, to prevent documentation fraud as well as identity fraud. So if you have requested this whilst processing the credit application on TPN, at the top of the report, you will then click on the Verified Income tab that has returned. This will then provide you with a bank statement analysis. The graph that you can see on screen currently is going to give you an overview of the last 6 months' income versus expenditure. And then on the right-hand side, we can see these different indicators where you can confirm the current balance at that point in time when the bank statements were requested, the average income earned over those past 6 months, and typically what date do they receive their salary paid into that bank account. Further to this, you then have the ability to download the actual bank statement that has returned directly from that applicant's bank. So below this graph, you will see a download report link. And if you click on this, it will then provide you with the actual bank statement that has returned from the bank. So again, this allows you to compare and confirm that the documents that they have indeed supplied you with, does it all match? Is the balances the same? Is the transactions the same? As these bank statements can be easily falsified. You can also use this in support of the application. Let's say if the parent has not submitted their bank statements to the school yet, you can then use this and request it directly from TPN in order for you to not have a delayed process while processing that exemption application.
Exactly. And we've had a couple of questions basically saying that what they find is that parents will potentially have multiple bank accounts and they'll submit just the bank account that has the lowest balance. But by looking at the verified online bank statements, you can assess whether or not you believe that this is actually a transactional account that people use on the day-to-day, or if it is in fact just a savings account that they put a little bit into every month. If you have any sort of doubt in your mind, you can always go straight back to the applicant and say, look, we don't believe that this is your main transactional account, and you can make that request for the additional information that you require. If you feel like you're being misled, then you have the right to act on that.
I think it's also then important to just mention that within your smart check, you have other reports as well that contains valuable information.
Absolutely.
So for example, on the TPN reports where you can see rental, levy or school fee data, and as well as on the TransUnion page where it's hosting the SACRA data, which is purely just the different types of account information. So in terms of that aspect, you can kind of see if this parent has 10 different clothing accounts and they are paying all of the accounts.
And you can also compare it to your verified online bank statement. You can see whether or not those amounts are going off every month, and you can then make the determination whether or not there are other accounts out there that haven't been disclosed.
And I think schools must be aware that this is not a process where we've granted the exemption, what's done is done. The schools can go back and check and verify the information and reconsider. That is per the regulations, is that they can reconsider and say, is this exemption still necessary? Do we need to adjust the exemption accordingly if a partial exemption, for example?
Yeah, so I think the key is to make effective use of what is available.
Use the resources in front of you.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so now a school has received the application. They've looked at the verified online bank statements and their smart check. Ashleigh, what is the next steps for the school and the SGB with regards to their responsibilities and how to move forward?
Greg, I think it's important to consider and for schools and SGB to note that right at the outset, when the parent comes in with their application or is requesting the application, that the school has an obligation to assist the parents as best they can. Whether it be with the exemption application or if they are not happy with the outcome provided from the SGB at the appeal process as well. So that's imperative to note. What's also important for schools to note is that they have to disclose what the fees are for that year as per Annexure A, and they also have to ask the parents if they need to apply for the exemption. The exemption regulations need to be visible to parents or given to them upon request. And so it's imperative, and it goes without saying as well, that any information provided for an exemption is confidential. And so the SGB must please ensure confidentiality on the part of the parents applying. Greg, and then now getting to the nitty-gritty detail.
Yes, we were talking a little bit earlier about how there's a formula which you must use in order to determine exactly what percentage of an exemption is going to be given. And I believe that we're going to show that formula up on screen.
We are.
I promise you it's not as daunting as it looks. Ashleigh's going to walk you through every step of that process.
Okay, so the SGB, they have a duty to decide within 30 days of receipt of the application whether or not an exemption is going to be granted and what type of exemption is going to be granted. In this, they have to apply a formula set out in the regulations. So Greg, maths was not my forte.
Me neither.
But even for me, this is not as bad as it seems. So we've got the formula there. E equals 100, and then open brackets, F plus A over C, close brackets. So you're thinking, oh my goodness, what is this?
What
What is going on? Okay, so E is the school fees as a proportion of the income of a parent, right? So that is what we are looking to calculate. And Greg, that is going to be a percentage, as we can clearly see from the 100 there. And then F is the annual school fees for one child. It's imperative to note that this is for one child that a school charges in terms of Section 39 of the Act. So say a parent has 2-3 children at the school, the school and the SGB must take the highest fees. So it's often that it's the grade 6 or the grade 7 learner or grade 11, grade 12 that will have a higher fee. And so that must be considered, and it is in respect of one child.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions coming in about the issue of multiple children. So I hope that this answers your question. So it's that main top amount that is the highest fee.
That's correct. It's F.
Yeah.
Then we have A. A is the additional monetary contributions paid by a parent in relation to a learner's attendance of or participation in any program of a public school.
So Ashleigh, like you've mentioned now, any program of the school, what happens if the school also provides like extra maths classes or English classes, which takes place after the formal school hours? There's usually a fee for those classes. Is those the types of charges that would also be applied with A or to A?
Chanel, it's such a good question. Hey, so A is, it would be anything above and beyond the services that are required of the public school that are charged by the public school. So yes, something like extra classes. Another example would also be tours, any school outings, activities. That is the value of A for that year. And then C is the combined annual gross income of parents. And I know a lot of you will be asking the combined
There's definitely
issue.
a lot of questions coming through on divorced parents.
We will be addressing that a bit later on. But yes, C is the combined annual gross income of parents. And then 100, of course, is the number by which the answer arrives at in the brackets is multiplied so as to get a percentage.
Actually, just to stop you there for a second, we have another question come through from Odette Swift, which is quite a handy one to know. Are things like hostel fees or accommodation fees included in A? And I think it's important to realize that if it's a service that school is offering, and that school is a fee-paying public school, which is what we're dealing with here, it is all of those amounts that are in addition to the fees. It's all the fees that are going to be paid.
Yeah, so look, I mean, the fee amount, it's dependent. A lot of public schools often charge fees for day learners and then fees for hostels and students in hostel. So it needs to be considered on that basis, but A is specifically above and beyond what that public school offers. So then the value of E is then applied to a table designated in the regulations that determines the percentage of the exemption for which a parent will qualify. The table only applies in respect of partial exemptions. So it's important to note that this only applies in respect, the table only applies in respect of partial exemptions. Yeah. So you'll see that in the regulations, there are various different types of circumstances to which they'll say, yes, this child or this parent will be granted a total exemption, or a partial exemption, or a conditional exemption. So I'm not going to go through each circumstance set out, but basically what's important to note is that if E is equal to or greater than 10%, a total exemption will be granted. If E is equal to 3.5%, then the parent qualifies for a partial exemption. If E is equal to 2.5%, then the parent does not qualify for an exemption unless he or she has 3 or more children at the same public school or another public school which is not deemed a fee-paying public school. So those are the main circumstances. If obviously a parent has applied and they have many children at the same school or another fee-paying public school, the school will have to consider that because that will determine the percentage as well, and what whether or not they are entitled to a partial exemption.
So now sort of touching on, oh sorry Chanel, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just thinking, now that, so let's say now they've gone through this whole process, they have applied the specific type of exemption. Throughout the year, if it comes to light that there has been a change in the parents' financial status, can the school then reassess or reevaluate the exemption that has been given at that point in time?
Absolutely. So the regulations do allow for the school to reconsider it, adjust the percentage where needs be. And so that's imperative to note, that it is not a once-off process and that is it done for the year, you know. So as I mentioned earlier, the SGB has to assess this within 30 days of receiving the application, and then they have a duty to notify the parent who has applied, or the parents who have applied, within 7 days of the outcome. Of course, if the parent is not happy, they're entitled to appeal the process to the head of departments, which is, you know, there is another process to that. I know we have our 8-step process. I don't know if Piet was able to show that to our viewers, stipulating as well the appeal process. And so that what's important to note just with the appeal process, that if it goes to the head of departments, the school will be notified that the parent is appealing, and that they will have to halt on any collection-based processes whilst it's under consideration by the head of departments.
So it puts a little bit of a pause on things. So if those fees are still outstanding, the exemption's been denied, you can't quite jump ahead to legal action just yet, but you can wait for that appeals process to end. Ash, we're going to discuss briefly a little bit of combined annual gross income of parents being considered. And there was a lovely question that actually came through from Peter Rademan. And so I'll address the one part and Ashleigh will address the part on exemptions. So the parents are divorced, mother applies and gets 100% exemption. The father has been handed over because they didn't apply for exemption. The father says they're not liable because he argues that he has a court order in place saying that the mother's liable for the fees. Please advise on the father's liability. Something that's important to note is that in terms of the Schools Act, both parents are jointly and severally liable for those payments. They are both liable to school fees for the amounts that are there. Mother's being given an 100% exemption, father is still liable for school fees. A court order is something that applies between the parents. A school is not a party to that court order. So when that court order is granted, the father can't just hand it to a school and say, I'm not liable, here's a court order that's binding on the mother saying that she has to pay. School has every right to go after the father for the amounts that they're liable for, and at a later date, the father can enforce his court order against the mother.
Absolutely. Greg, you've hit the nail on the head. Parents are jointly and severally liable. So if a parent A was given a conditional exemption, and I'm going to just speak briefly on the Supreme Court of Appeal case in which they said that the annual gross income of parent A was considered on its own, where the parent B was not seen, or they weren't aware, they were no longer in contact, so she could not confirm the annual gross income to get the combined gross income. So if a parent is no longer in the picture or is reluctant to assist in this application, then the school will consider the annual gross income of parents A who has applied, and if they would be granted a partial exemption, it would be on a certain condition. So in that case specifically, she was granted a conditional exemption, but she had the duty to report to the school if she receives an increase, for example. So yes, it is possible to consider on one parent alone. Is the school able to go after parent B? Absolutely, because parents are jointly and severally liable in terms of the South African Schools Act.
And again, if they're refusing to provide that information, then there are ways and means that you can go about collecting it. And Chanel's going to now show us something on the system. So we've got a lot of questions that have come through about how do you handle a situation where a parent says that I've got no contact? How do you handle it where a parent has refused or has disappeared? We've got a wonderful functionality on the TPN system called TPN Trace Enquiry, which Chanel is going to now take us through and show a little bit about.
Thanks, Greg. Best of all about the Trace Enquiry is that because it's not an actual credit check, you do not need to have consent from that parent that you are wanting to draw this information on. So once again, once you've signed in on TPN, you will have the ability to run a Trace Enquiry.
Just very importantly to stop you there for a second, whilst you don't have to have consent in the same way that you have a credit check, you still need to have a valid reason, a valid legal reason for doing that Trace Enquiry. So when you're dealing with exemptions, when you're dealing with things like this where it's collecting debts, you are allowed to use Trace Enquiry, but please don't think that this is an open-ended thing where you can just go and trace all of your friends and family for a bit of fun.
Get all the information.
You do have to have valid reasons for running the trace, and if you don't have those valid reasons, there are consequences. Exemptions are one such reason when you can use this Trace Enquiry.
Thanks, Greg. So once you are signed in on TPN, you will click on the Credit Checks tab at the top. And then on the left-hand side, if we go down just a little bit, we can see that you have the ability to trace the consumer by using different methods. So in the case where you are looking for parent B's contact number or the last known contact address, you can then use the Trace Consumer by ID or passport number. You will be given a step 1 where you then need to go and enter that particular parent's ID number or passport number. And when you then click on next, the system will then actually provide you with the possible matches for that particular individual. Once you've identified the person who you are wanting to draw that information on, when you click on the identifier itself for that person, it will then run the full Trace Enquiry for you. The trace result will be a combination of your summary page. It will have a tab for your TPN Trace information, which is all of the information hosted on our database in terms of the last known contact numbers and last known addresses, as well as the information that's been recorded on TransUnion's database in respect of the last known contact numbers and addresses. The summary report itself will provide you with that consumer's details, and then it will give you a combined overview of the information that's been drawn from both TPN and TransUnion. And like I said, you can view the different reports to see what has been captured on the various bureaus in terms of when they last went and applied for credit in the industry, or perhaps rental or school fees based in our industry of the information that's recorded on our credit bureau.
Chanel, thank you so much for showing us that. I hope that answers everyone's questions with regards to the Trace Enquiries. If for whatever reason you want to know a little bit more about Trace Enquiries, then you can get in touch with us either at helpdesk@tpn.co.za. You can also contact us on legal@tpn.co.za, or at the number that's up on screen, 0861 876 000. I think this is going to bring us towards the end of the formal portion of our session, where we showcase the system and get some legal background. So we're going to move on into the Q&A. As you can see, the laptop has now moved from on the desk here to on my lap, because we're going to get into the portion where we're dealing with your questions.
All the questions.
The feedback forms for this session will also be posted into the chat now. Please make sure you fill out that feedback form. Let us know exactly what you want to hear from us, the next sort of training that's going to be available for schools. If there's anything that you want particular information on, let us know. We can facilitate that for you. Then if for whatever reason we don't manage to get to your question today, please, those email addresses that I gave you before, legal@tpn.co.za and helpdesk@tpn.co.za, please get in touch with us. We'll do our best to assist you with your question. So we had a couple of questions that actually came in before our webinar where clients got in touch with us, and we've decided to save their questions to showcase here. So first question that came through a little bit before, how do schools consider SASSA grants in respect of exemptions? Do they have a duty to report this to anyone?
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for your questions in advance. We do appreciate them. In respect of SASSA grants, as I was saying earlier, it does fall within the realm of automatic exemptions. So we do need to consider this. If you look at the regulations at the definition of automatic exemptions, you will see at the very last point, it speaks to childcare grants. Do you have a duty to report to anyone? It will form part of the reporting to the head of department at the end of term 1 with respect to reporting all your exemption data to the head of departments. So that will be obviously the number of applications, the number of total exemptions granted, partial exemptions granted, and those that were not granted.
Yeah, and then we have another question that came through from Alex, which is what happens if one of the parents, they don't have the unabridged birth certificate, their ID doesn't appear on the unabridged birth certificate? How do you trace it? So you do have the option to obviously get in touch with the other parent who's applying for the exemption. They can provide you with that information for the purposes of for the exemption and tracing process, and then you can follow that the process that Chanel showed you a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
and you can input that ID.
Well, in respect of if they don't have the ID, if they perhaps have the contact number for that parent that they are looking for the ID number because it's not on the certificate, you have then the ability to do a trace on the cell phone number, for example, which will then again give you all of the possible matches for that number.
And I believe even if you have their name and date of birth, those are also metrics that can be used.
Date of birth, yeah.
You're not limited just to an ID number.
Yes.
The second question here, which came through also before the session, was are parents liable for fees whilst their application is under consideration?
The short answer to that, Greg, is yes, they are still liable. The one thing to note again is that if the parent is not happy with the outcome at the SGB phase, that if it goes to appeal, the head of department will say stop all collection, and that is when the school must just halt until that outcome of the appeal-based process is heard. So yes, they are in fact liable until the exemption is granted.
So Ashleigh, if I may just jump in here from a systems perspective in terms of helping our schools on how to do that and record that information on TPN. While they are waiting for the outcome of that exemption being approved or not approved, whatever the case might be, if the parent doesn't pay, the school can then still update that payment behavior to reflect it did not pay if the parent did not pay.
Absolutely, yes.
And those are things that are going to then filter through into your future exemption applications that are going to go out, potentially if they move to another school or something along those sort of lines. The next question that came through came from Sean, and is what happens if the child care grant is for a sibling that is not in the school? Does that income that you receive still apply into the formula? I think I'm just expanding on their question a little.
Yes, no, it is a very good question. And the school will need to, the parent will need to disclose that information to the school, because what's important to note is that we consider the table provided for in the regulations considers the number of learners. And it's important to consider that, especially if that child is at another fee-paying public school. Because then that will result in a different percentage or the calculation of E. So yes, the parent will need to disclose that to the school, and even if it is granted in respect of one child, they still have a duty to inform the school so as to ensure the most accurate calculation.
The next question is a little bit semi-off topic, but still very much within topic. So if there's a relative who is looking after the child, do they need the legal certificate of guardianship from the Department of Social Development in order to apply for an exemption for the child that they are looking after? I think it's important that we don't necessarily only have to deal with biological parents.
Correct.
If you're a legal guardian and you've obtained the documentation that is required to be the legal guardian, then I think you also have that.
That would be sufficient, yeah.
You also have the ability to apply for exemptions.
Absolutely, and it's an affidavit to that effect, a court order to that effect would suffice. So it's not just parents, but of course guardians as well.
Great. And then the final question that we've got coming from the audience, again, if for whatever reason I haven't managed to get to yours or I've missed it on the computer here, please, you can email us, helpdesk@tpn.co.za or legal@tpn.co.za. Thank you for joining us. The final question is from Jacques van Tonda and says, can the school process the exemption from the date the application has been received, or must it always be for the full year? Let's say, for example, that the application for exemption is only received in June. Do you do it on a proportion of the school fees, or is it something that can only be done for the full year?
It would be done in respect, technically, exemption applications for fee-paying public schools open in Feb. And so, yes, it would be done in proportion because it's an annual-based process. So that is something also for schools to consider. It is not for the entire year, it would be for the what is remaining of that year.
Perfect. And then a sort of linked question that came through is, can a parent apply for an exemption retrospectively? Can they go back to the previous year's fees and apply for exemption? I don't believe they can, but if you can also email us and ask us that question again, we'll make sure we have a good look into it. Maybe Ashleigh, you know a bit better.
Greg, it's not mentioned for in the regulations, so I would doubt it, especially if the school has gone and charged for those fees. It's very, very difficult to go retrospectively as well. If it's not mentioned for in the regulations, I would say no.
Thank you, everyone. That's all of the questions that we have today. If for whatever reason you want to go back and watch this webinar again, there is a recording that is available on the TPN YouTube channel. Please go like and subscribe to make sure you're notified of all of the new videos and webinars that go live on the channel. The feedback form will still be live for a little while longer, so if you haven't completed it already, please go and do that now. And then finally, Ashleigh and Chanel, thank you so much for joining us in studio today.
Thanks, you.
It's been very enlightening for all the people at home, I'm sure. Thank you again for tuning in and joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.